and welcome back to my channel. I'm Dr. Jennifer Mata. This video is going to be about planning. In this video, we're going to cover the definition of planning, so what it entails, all the different components that are part of the planning process, and what are the benefits or the uses of planning. And it's going to be interesting for teachers and teacher educators. And it's going to be interesting also for parents that are looking for particular questions to ask teachers to see how well prepared they are in thinking about the activities and the experiences that they are going to provide for the children under their care. So let's get started. So planning is the process of thinking about and organizing everything that goes into the learning and teaching process. And we talked about in last week's video on educational models, we talked about 3 bodies of knowledge that are really important to have when one is going to plan. So if you're thinking of planning, you need to know about the content that you're planning on. You need to know about child development, where the children that you're working with are in terms of development and where they are going toward next. So you need to know what you need to do sort of in the middle to get them from point A, where they're right now, to point B, where you want them to be in terms of the area of development that you're working with. And the third element or the third component of knowledge that you need to know in terms of planning are the requirements for the specific grade level that you are planning for. So for example, if you're a first grade teacher, there are going to be a set of state goals, standards, benchmarks, and some go down to the descriptive level of the descriptor, so that level of specificity, and indicate what happens in each of the content areas for that particular grade. So you need to have those 3 bodies of knowledge. Knowledge of content, knowledge of development, and then knowledge of the requirements of the grade level. Another thing that's really important to know when you're planning are the children that you're working with. So their specific and particular needs and their particular interests. That's very important because that's going to be the motivational hook that you have when you plan. You need to know what drives them, what they're interested in, what they are passionate about in order to best plan for them. When we're talking about planning, we're talking about all the experiences in the teaching and learning process that sometimes are in the hands of the teacher. So it's going to depend on the curriculum. And last week's video was about educational models, and we talked about different kinds of curricula that are available for teachers to use. So if the curricula is a commercial curriculum or a packaged curricula, the planning is going to be already set for the teacher. The curriculum is going to provide lesson plans, it's going to provide activities. Some curricula already provide materials, books that the teachers are going to read to the children, or that the children are going to engage with in terms of reading. Other types of curriculum, the emergent curriculum, the curriculum that is focused on children or child-centered, is going to allow the teacher to plan on her own or his own terms. And this kind of curriculum is the type of planning that we're going to be focusing on, the planning that is designed by the teacher for the specific children that she or he is working with. So if that is the case and you're working with an emergent curriculum or a child-centered curriculum and you have the complete ownership of the planning process, then you need to focus on a couple things. You need to know the what and the how, and that's going to be encompassed in the planning. So the what has to do with the content and what is it that you want the children to learn, and the how has to do with the pedagogy or the strategies, or how is that learning going to be accomplished. So both of these elements are going to come into play. The how well is also a component that we're going to see that is going to be integrated into planning, although some see it as separate. When we're looking at the learning and teaching process, we have a triad of elements, right? We have the planning component, the instructional component, and then we have the assessment component. And these three elements are constantly being used in a more circular than linear kind of fashion. And when we plan, the how well has to do with the assessment portion. So how well did the learning occur? How well did the learner acquire the concept or the skill that was being facilitated through the plan or the lesson being shared? And that how well goes into that assessment component typically. And right now we're focusing on planning and what do we do before that instructional component occurs, right? So we're in the planning section, then we would go to the instruction portion, and then we would go to the assessment portion. But within the planning, we're going to see that I typically ask my students and teacher candidates that I train to think about how would they assess that particular lesson that they're planning. And within the lesson plan template that I ask them to fill out, there is a section on assessment where they have to identify how the learning experience will be assessed and how will they gauge if the children reached the learning that they set them out to reach. So I'm going to share with you the template that I designed and that I use with my students in order to help them learn how to best plan. So there are a few elements that are initially identified. One is the curricular area that we're planning for, and the other is the grade level. So for example, if we're planning a lesson for social studies, we would identify social studies as the curriculum area, and if we're teaching first graders, we would identify first grade as the grade level and the age of the students as 6 or 7 years of age, depending on how old our students are. After that, what we need to identify is what I have termed a developmental snapshot. So that developmental snapshot is going to take a snapshot, it's going to take an image of what a written image of what the children are, where they are in terms of particular areas of development. And we can span through all the areas of development: cognitive, social, emotional, language, and in language we have reading and writing, physical and gross and fine motor, and then spiritual. I would include spiritual. You'll find that in most books, spiritual development is not included, but I would definitely include where they are in terms of spirituality and their spiritual growth as well. In the snapshot, we look at where they are in the different areas of development, but we also look at their prior knowledge. So if we are, say, facilitating a lesson plan on community, which is a topic that goes under the social studies content umbrella, we would try to figure out what our students know about community. If they're familiar with the definition of community, how well do they understand this concept? Do they know what a community entails? Do they know who is part of a community? Do they know the different roles of folks that participate in a community? Or if they're lacking in that knowledge set still. So we want to know what they're capable of doing skill-wise in all the areas of development, but we also know what their knowledge or prior knowledge base is. Because this lesson that we're planning is going to take them from their point A in terms of development and prior knowledge and push them forward to point B, or at least making attempts to move toward point B. Because we always want to be challenging them, moving them forward in terms of knowledge acquisition and development of development skills. So after we've identified those aspects, the curriculum, the content area or the curricular area, the age and grade level of the students, the snapshot of their development and their prior knowledge, we then start to think about what is it that we want to teach. So we have a section in the template that's termed goals, and here the students are to identify which state goal, standard, benchmark they're going to be working with in that particular lesson. And then once that is clearly identified, that is something that they should be working on for that particular content area in that particular grade, Then they establish an instructional goal, which is what the teacher wants to accomplish with that particular lesson. And they establish a learning objective. The learning objective is for the children. What are the children needing to do in order to demonstrate that they reach that benchmark, that state goal, standard, and benchmark that we set out to facilitate with this particular lesson that we're planning. Once that is identified, then we can start thinking of the how. So the materials is going to be the section where we're going to think about what are the materials that we need to incorporate into the classroom. What is the setting going to look like? Maybe we need to rearrange the environment, the classroom environment, rearrange the furniture, provide different particular materials that need to come into the classroom to facilitate the learning experience. So we think about all that and we make a list of all the resources and materials that we need. Some lesson plans include elements of technology, and if that's the case, that needs to be set up and ready to go for when the learning experience begins. That has to be set in place. We don't want to waste precious learning time, so we want to have the setup all be done and thought about way before the learning experience is to occur. Once that is in place, then we go into the component of the template, lesson plan template that focuses on the instruction. And the instruction is where the learning happens, right? So one of the first things that I tell my students to do when we're planning is to have an opening statement. The opening statement makes it really clear to the children what is it that we're going to learn in this lesson. So today we're going to learn about communities, or today we're going to explore about the different roles that members of the communities have, or today we're going to specifically look at firefighters and why are they so important to us as a community, or today we're going to look at our role as civic servants and how we can best help others. You need to have an opening statement that clearly states for the children what is it we're going to do in this lesson today. And sometimes it's really clear for the teachers because they've done all the planning beforehand and all the prepping beforehand what this lesson is going to be about, but it's not so clear for the children. So having an opening statement takes care of that, provides clarity for the children and makes it really obvious what is it that we're going to spend our time doing for the next 30 or 45 minutes, whatever the allocated time frame for that instruction period or that lesson has been. After you've done the opening statement in the instruction portion of the lesson plan, you start delineating step by step what is going to happen. So what are you going to ask the children to do? What is it that they're going to do? If you're going to be organizing them in small groups, if you're going to organize them as a whole class, as a large group, the whole class is going to come together. What kind of activity is this? Where are they going to be located? And so on. So you have directives there. And this can be enumerated. So you can have, first, I'm going to ask the children to sit in small groups. 2, I'm going to ask the children to open up their social studies books. 3, I'm going to ask the children to read the first couple paragraphs. 4, I'm going to hand out a questionnaire with different questions that they need to investigate and research, and so on, right? So you're delineating everything that you're going to do and then what you're going to ask them to do as well. But within this instruction portion as well, you need to include what we call differentiated instruction, strategies for differentiated instruction. And here is where you make evident how well you know the children that you're working with. So you're going to have some children that excel at that particular skill and knowledge base that you are providing in that lesson. And you know this beforehand. So you're going to incorporate some strategies into the lesson plan to accommodate those children so that they don't get bored, so that they don't finish too quickly and then get into trouble when they have nothing to do. And to make sure that the lesson is still challenging and successful for them. Another group of children that are right on task, that you know that this is going to be enough of a challenge for them and they're going to be able to complete it in the time allocated for it. And you have some strategies to keep them on task. And you have another group of children that might be not there yet. So they're not in the advanced group, they're not in the sort of typically developing group, but they're in a group that is falling behind, be it because they don't have the necessary skills to address this particular lesson, or because they came into this grade with a lapse in readiness. So they weren't ready for, say, if we're continuing with the example of first grade, they weren't ready for first grade yet. So they need to play catch up, but you are the one who needs to play catch up for them. So you need to include the strategies into the lesson plan to help them catch up with the rest of the group. There are another group of students that also you need to take into account, and when we're talking about differentiated instruction, this would be a great section of the lesson plan in which to include strategies to address English language learners. So in the US, in particular in urban areas in the US, we have a lot of immigrant children whose first language is not English, and they speak a variety of different languages. And for you to make sure that they fully understand the lessons and are on task and are learning and are making progress towards achieving that learning objective that you set out for them and that benchmark and standard and state goal that's set out for them for that particular lesson, you need to incorporate some strategies. So if you have an English language learner or an ELL that is not very proficient, you might include strategies such as including materials in that child's native language to facilitate then comprehension. Or you might pair that child with a buddy that speaks his same native language but is more advanced in English and is capable of comprehending what's going on in the lesson and helping out that child that does not have the required proficiency yet. So there's numerous strategies that you could include in order to help that child stay on task and get the most optimal experience from this particular lesson that you're planning. And I'm going to make a video specifically on strategies for working with ELLs that I think would be very useful. But this differentiated instruction section of the instruction portion of the lesson plan template is where you would be talking about and explaining what strategies you'd be using to tend to all the different levels in which the children are in terms of either English proficiency or development stage. Another component that is included in this section is academic language, which means that in every lesson that you teach, you need to take advantage of including vocabulary words, new words that the children don't know. We see from research that there is a correlation between vocabulary and academic success. So the more ample the vocabulary is, the more chances there is for academic success. So we want our children to be successful. So each lesson is going to present the opportunity to include vocabulary words to amplify the vocabulary of the children. So this is a great place to identify which words are going to be included and to include definitions of those words so that when you introduce the word and you explain it to the children, you have a ready on-hand definition that you can share with them, and you can explain what this word means and how do you use it in context and how do you use it in a sentence and so on. Another component that is important to include is critical thinking questions. So what kinds of questions are you as a teacher going to ask the children to be able to expand their thought process? And these critical thinking questions are not knowledge checking questions. So are not the questions of, well, how does a community work? Or what elements do we find in a community if we're still going back to that community lesson plan? Those are good questions, but those questions check for knowledge. They check to see how much the children know. And those are questions that we could use to evaluate at the end of the lesson, or those are questions that we could use to gauge prior knowledge at the beginning of the lesson, checking to see what is it that the children already know about this topic, or at the end, what is it that the children learned about this topic. So those questions that are closed-ended, that have one correct answer, are not what we're referring to when we're talking about critical thinking questions. Critical thinking questions are open-ended questions, are questions that help the children think outside the box, that have many possible answers. And there are questions that when we ask them to the children, we're not necessarily expecting to hear something in particular. We are open to have them come up with whatever their imagination is capable of. So they're questions that advanced critical thinking. They're questions that promote creativity. They're questions that help the children process the knowledge and make it their own. And that's when they truly learn, is when they have acquired the knowledge and they're so confident in their acquisition of knowledge that they can use it in a different environment, in a different way, see it from a different perspective, and still grasp that knowledge that we're trying to facilitate. So open-ended questions examples would be, well, what would happen if we didn't have a community in place? Or perhaps what would happen if we're talking about different roles in the community, what would happen if we didn't have policemen? What do you think would happen to our community? And then their imagination flies, right? Because anything could happen, or maybe nothing happens. Or can you just try to paint a picture of what the world would be like if we took one of these elements out, or if we incorporated one of these elements in? So they start looking at things from different perspectives, and you want to have well identified in your lesson plans those kinds of open-ended questions that you think you are going to ask. And of course, lesson plans are a guide. Are sort of a roadmap that the teacher follows, and it helps the teacher stay focused on what the goal is for that particular span of time, but it doesn't mean that the teacher needs to be restricted to that plan. So if the children ask other questions, or if other things happen and then the teacher comes up with these great open-ended questions or creative critical thinking questions to ask, then by all means go off script, right? You don't have to stay within the confines of what you wrote out that was going to happen in those 30 or 45 minutes of instructional time. Last two things to include in the instructional portion of the lesson are managing behavior techniques. So if you know that there are certain techniques and strategies that work with the children that you're working with, if you're working in a small group, or that work with the entire classroom, then make a note of this. These are the things that you're going to do if this happens. For example, if the children are misbehaving, what are you going to use? Do you have a behavioral chart that you use to remind them what they should be doing? Or are you going to come close to them and physically tap them on the shoulder and to remind them that what they should be doing? Or are you going to have a child in each table, if you're working in small groups, have them monitor and remind the others what they should be doing? So there are different strategies and techniques, and we're going to have another video dedicated to behavioral management as well, that you could be using that could help children stay on task. But they need to be identified in the lesson plan as well. And lastly, in this section, you want to have closure. So as you had an opening statement to inform the children what we were going to do during this period of time, you also want a closing statement that summarizes what was the takeaway. What did we learn from this experience? And that can be done by the children. So you can ask the children, okay, summarize. What did we do? What did we learn from this lesson? Or you can just, in one sentence, this is what we learned in these 30 or 45 minutes of instruction that we just had, and summarize it for them. Another section of the lesson plan template is assessment. And here I ask my students to design an informal assessment tool to gauge how well or how much progress the children made in achieving the learning objective. So we're not talking about standardized tests or assessment tools that have been normalized. We are talking about informal assessment tools designed by the teacher, such as a checklist or an anecdotal record log, or a rubric that has been designed to see the different stages in which the children are in regard to that particular learning objective. Be it have they mastered the content, or have they mastered the skill or the behavior that was going to be facilitated through this lesson plan. Aside from that, we also have a section of linkage to home and the community, and this is thinking about how we're going to take this lesson further. So what else are we going to do to amplify or extend the knowledge base in regards to this particular concept? So we were talking again about community. What are we going to send home for homework? What are we going to ask the parents to do with the children at home? What are we going to ask the community to be part of? Or are we going to take the children in the next lesson out to the community and to be able to connect with what's happening around in their surroundings, in their nearby surroundings? And the last portion has to do with reflection. So this is the last section of the lesson plan template that I provide. And it has to do with reflecting upon what worked and what didn't work during the lesson in terms of the teacher role, and what worked and what didn't work in terms of the learners, in terms of the children as well. What did they struggle with? What did they need more time with? And making notes of those aspects that were challenges or that were difficult for them is going to help you then take that into account for the following lesson that you're going to plan for them. I'm going to share with you now some books that have some different templates that I use for teaching teacher candidates how to plan that I think might be useful for you, and some images of other templates that also have been used to create and design lesson plans. Also, weekly plans. Some places don't necessarily have a lesson plan template, but they plan the week. And in the week, they just identify what kinds of activities related to a particular benchmark, standard, or state goal they're going to facilitate during the week. Again, what I'm sharing here is the template that I use with my students. There are many different templates that we can use when we are planning, and it's also going to depend on where you work and the center or the school that you work at. They might have a particular template that they like to use, depending on the educational model that they're working under. And again, if you're working with a curriculum that's a commercial curriculum, then you're not going to be doing or be able to do a lot of this type of emergent planning, taking into account the interests and the needs of the particular children that you are working with. I hope this was useful and that it will help you in your future planning as a teacher. And if you're a parent, perhaps it'll give you ideas of what to ask teachers in terms of what are they doing to plan, how do they plan, and what do they take into consideration when they plan. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe or give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and come again next week for another video. Bye.